So a warm welcome to everyone here. As I mentioned earlier, Diana is away for the evening, teaching on retreat. So I'm happy to be here with you this evening. My name is Kim Allen. I want to talk tonight about thought, perhaps in a different way, though, than you may have heard. We definitely use thought all the time in daily life, but it's also easy in meditation to see that thought is usually what distracts us in some way. We lose our mindfulness because we start thinking. So then it's easy. Some people conclude from this that thinking is always bad, or that the aim of meditation is somehow to eliminate thinking. Thinking mind can only be a hindrance. But actually, that idea is not in line with the Buddhist teachings. The Buddha had a more nuanced view of thought and its role in the normal functioning as well as in the awakening of the mind. There's a place for thought on the path of development. So he identified which kinds of thought are actually unskillful and unhelpful. And he also talked about kinds of thought that are helpful, that are skillful. Some of them might even be necessary along the path of liberation. So I will talk somewhat about unskillful thought because it's something that we're very familiar with, and it's an important thing to have some sense of how to work with. But I want to leave plenty of room to talk about the helpful kinds of thought and conceptuality that we can do, because we don't get to hear about those quite as much. And there are a number of them described in the Buddhist teachings. Now, in the end, what you may have heard from teachers is correct in that the ordinary thinking and conceptualizing mind is a hindrance to freedom at some point, and it will be let go. Maybe we'll even develop some alternatives to it along the path. But nonetheless, even concepts and thinking have a function along our path of meditation and in daily life. I think we're going to need our whole mind to awaken. And so that would include thought. So let's look more carefully at what is useful in the thinking mind and what is not. So starting with how we often experience our mind, at least at the beginning of our spiritual development, and often for many people at the beginning of a sit all along the path, what we experience is a lot of discursive, what's called discursive or excessive thought, where the mind is going over conversations, it's making plans, it's worrying about what that person might have meant by what they did yesterday. We're sort of caught up in that, and it usually comes with a lot of largely unseen views about the world and about ourselves and all of that. And a lot of this thought is kind of running along habitual patterns. Most of this kind of thought is not especially original, and we've probably thought it before. And if we look more carefully, we can see that a lot of it is about myself and is essentially based somehow in wanting or not being very clear. So this kind of unhelpful thought, which I'm just going to call discursive thinking, this is the kind that is common at the beginning of a sit, shall we say, and it kind of dominates our mental experience. And so because of this, thinking gets a bad rap. It just sort of gets a blanket statement of, this is not useful, let it go, try not to think, try to get concentrated and not do that. But with that kind of attitude, if we have that idea that all thought is like that, we set up a lot of aversion in the mind. And this can actually just further entrench our tendency to think, right? As soon as we say, don't think of a purple elephant, that's all you're going to think about, right? So if you say, don't think, or stop all those conversations in the mind and get concentrated, there's a way in which that's not an effective approach. Yes. So it's unfortunate because some people can get caught in this aversive dynamic of hating their thoughts for a long time. And but if we look at the early Buddhist texts, there's a more nuanced understanding of the thinking mind. Thinking, as I said in the guided meditation, thinking is what minds do. It's a normal function of the mind. So this kind of normal, ordinary thought that we have at sort of top of mind can be skillful or unskillful. It can actually be either one of those. So I would say that maybe the initial task of practice is that if we have a lot of the discursive kind of thought, is that we somehow have to reduce that and enhance the skillful part, which is a form of right effort, essentially. So instead of thinking in terms of let's get rid of all the thought or let's quiet all that down, how about if we tried to change the balance so that more of the thought was skillful and less of it was unskillful? That's often a good way to start. So we can start to explore this different kinds of thinking by distinguishing the content of the thought from its qualities, let's say. So the content is what we're thinking about. It's about our friend or that thing that happened yesterday or the problem we have with our work. That's the content of the thought. But then the qualities have to do more with the energy behind the thought, how intense it is, the manner of the thought, what's the tone of it, and the experience of that thinking. How are we relating to it in some way? So the kinds of thought that are hindering our spiritual practice, the ones that I mentioned earlier, they have a certain set of qualities that we can identify. Most obviously, they're disconnected from present moment awareness. Discursive thought is about then and there. It's not really about here and now. So they feel kind of distant or vague. They're not connected. Secondly, they tend to be sticky. They catch the mind and draw it in. That's why we get sucked into this kind of discursive thought again and again. It has a hook somehow, a stickiness to it. And then thirdly, the energy of it is usually somewhat driven. There's a feeling of, I've got to play this out. I have to play out this conversation. I have to think through this problem. I have to devise some idea about this. I have to figure out why this view is correct. There's a sense of drivenness to it. So that's also useful to know. So all of this adds up to seeing, when we see the qualities of this unskillful thought, it becomes clear why we get drawn into it so easily. It has a lot of qualities that are going to pull the mind away from a more subtle experience like the breath or the body. So we can understand that, it's going to be hard to turn away from discursive thought. So we can maybe not blame yourself for that so much. So instead of trying to get rid of this kind of thought, I like to talk about reducing the intensity of discursive thought as kind of our first task in practice, if you will. There are a lot of methods for this in the Buddhist teachings. It's clear that this has been an issue for people for a long time. So again, you're not alone if this is something that you experience. So it's not a focus of this talk that I'll talk about a lot of methods for working with discursive thought. That could be a whole talk in and of itself, but I'll name a few of them since it's good to be reminded. So they include, first and foremost, breath and body awareness. That's why we talk about that so much. That's why those are the first instructions. I found these to be the best remedies for discursive thought. In fact, the Buddha says, a meditator should cultivate mindfulness of breathing for cutting off distracting thoughts. That's a quote right from the sutta. So the Buddha was talking about this quite directly to his disciples. So breath and body are a good choice because they're always in the present moment. They immediately take away that quality of discursive thought that is not in the present moment, that vagueness that it has. But also, really, there are other ways that we can reduce the intensity. So, for example, we can use our thinking mind for something else. We can start directing the energy into thoughts that are about the present moment. And this is the point of noting practice. So you may have heard of noting practice, where sometimes as we sit, we gently name or label the experiences that we're having. Oh, experience of sadness, an experience of pressure, experience of heat, experience of joy. Just noting as we go along a little, simple word that goes with what we're experiencing, and that redirects some of the energy that could have gone into unskillful thought. It directs it into thought that's about the present moment. It's that simple. So it reduces the intensity of that other kind of thought. Techniques like counting the breath are the same thing. We're using our thinking mind to be thinking about the present moment. And then, once we've gained a little bit of traction, we can actually turn mindfulness toward the thinking process itself. This is another good way to continue reducing the intensity of discursive thought. So we can kind of turn the good part of our analytical mind against the part that's trying to pull us away. So we can actually gain some insight about thought by looking in this way. We start to, for example, discern those three qualities that I talked about earlier, the nebulousness, the stickiness, and the drivenness of unskillful thought. All of that can come about as we start to be able to see thinking with mindfulness. So this means we can start to answer questions like, how do I know if a given thought that's coming in is one of these discursive or obsessive thoughts that's not useful, or if it's something that would be okay, more beneficial to have? And we can see quite clearly that generally discursive thought just is directed toward itself. It generates more and more discursion, and it doesn't ever doesn't quite resolve meaningfully. Whereas in contrast, thoughts that are more skillful, it's very easy still to be aware of the body. It's pretty easy to breathe through them, like I talked about in the guided meditation. So there are qualities that we can discern immediately as a thought starts to arise as to whether or not it's going to be a discursive one, and we should be very careful, or if it's a somewhat more skillful thought. And we'll talk in a moment more about what kinds of skillful thoughts there are that can arise. So we can start to have just a little bit of wisdom about our thinking. We can start to have more distinction about what kinds of thoughts there are, and know that some are useful and some are not. So I would say that the sort of initial part of Dharma practice, and maybe the initial part of the sit for many people, is to start using our analytical mind skillfully in order to reduce the impact of this discursive kind of thought that's vague, that's sticky, and that's driven. But actually, we can go one step further, and we can start looking at certain kinds of cognition that are actually praised in the suttas. This is sometimes a revelation for people to realize that there are kinds of thought that are worthy of developing in their own right. So I want to focus now, because I think it's rare that it's spoken well of in Dharma talks, that thought is spoken well of. So let's talk a little bit about skillful thought, thoughts that actually help cultivate the mind. So the Buddha praised learning quite highly in the suttas. Learning is offered as one of 5 highly meritorious qualities that we can have that are said to be a form of inner wealth in one sutta. And in another sutta, it's said that these are qualities that fortify the mind. So they literally strengthen it or build it up somehow. So here's the 5: faith or confidence, virtue, learning, generosity, and wisdom. It's an interesting list, isn't it? So we have 4 qualities that are maybe more common. You've heard them in other lists: faith, virtue or ethical conduct, generosity, and wisdom. Now, these are qualities that are named all over the text, and we might aspire to be developing those in ourselves. But what about this middle one, learning? What is that? And why is that named alongside virtue? So learning is as important as not killing, not stealing. It's as important as giving. It's as important as wisdom. So it's quite amazing. So what does this mean? What is meant here by learning? The word that's used there in Pali is actually a word that means literally what is heard. So it has to do with things that we have heard. And you can understand this from the way that things were taught in the Buddha's time. It wasn't that they had books. Most people couldn't even read or write for that matter. So if you wanted to hear teachings, you wanted to learn teachings, you had to go hear a teacher. It was about what you could hear. And the opportunity to hear the Dharma was very precious, actually. And so this quality of learning, though, is not literally just hearing, like I was within earshot and it entered my ears. It has to do also with being a little bit more active, given that we couldn't take notes, we couldn't listen to the recording later, we couldn't go consult a book. So learning in this thing of heard, what is heard, includes also some sense of active listening. So paying attention and kind of taking it in and integrating it into what we know. And it also includes memorizing it to some degree, remembering it well, not literally memorizing it, although that was done, but remembering it well enough that you would be able to use it the next day. If you heard a Dharma talk and had forgotten it by the time you walked home, it's not as useful as if you could remember something about it. So this quality of learning that was praised is to have a kind of an intelligent interaction with the teachings. And that is what starts to change our mind, what starts to develop the mind in a sense. So this kind of learning we can still do. We do it through listening to Dharma talks online, through taking notes, maybe through reading Dharma books, through reading suttas. By exposing our mind again and again, we may not remember everything so well, maybe not as well as they did when there was no other option. But nonetheless, as we hear and learn and listen to things, they kind of get into the mind in a way and start to come into our thoughts more often. Teachings will come into our thoughts. I like to tell a story where one time I was just in the kitchen washing the dishes or something, and I broke a cup. And a normal enough thing to have happen. But immediately what came to mind was the quote from Ajahn Chah, where he says, "Oh, I enjoy my cup very much, but for me, the cup is already broken," indicating an understanding of impermanence. But it's a line that I had heard or read a number of times. And when I broke the cup, my mind said, the cup was already broken. So it's just a simple moment where I could have gotten angry or, said a swear word, but instead this thought of the Dharma came to mind. And that's one of the fruits of this learning that's praised. And that's a useful kind of use of the thinking mind, the intelligent mind, the cognitive mind, the linguistic mind, all those things that we might associate with thinking, which is supposed to be bad, but it's not. It can be used well. There are also many beneficial ways to use the cognitive mind on the cushion. So the Buddha, for example, encouraged reflection on various inspiring themes that will invoke confidence and joy. So in one of the suttas, he offers 6 different themes that we could reflect on during sitting. And those include the qualities of the Buddha, the qualities of the Dharma, the qualities of the Sangha, our own virtue, our own generosity, and the fact that there are beings with well-developed minds in the world. So those are the 6 themes. And it's interesting. It's also interesting to note that where I said beings that have well-developed minds, what we reflect on is the fact that they have those 5 qualities I just mentioned. We reflect that there are beings in the world who have faith, virtue, learning, generosity, and wisdom. And just knowing that there are people like that can be inspiring, and it's skillful to think about that. So any of these themes is said to bring about, according to the sutta, inspiration in the meaning, inspiration in the Dharma, and joy connected with the Dharma. So it's interesting, isn't it, that qualities, heart qualities like faith, like motivation, and like joy can emerge from thought. So as an example, what are these reflections? There are specific words given for how we would reflect on each of these 6 themes, and the one for the Dharma is like this. The Dharma is well expounded by the Blessed One, to be seen here and now, timeless, inviting verification, pertinent, and to be realized by the wise for themselves. So it's 6 qualities of the Dharma, and we could just reflect on those, even during sitting. It's okay to reflect in this particular way. It's kind of like the question I asked, what about the Dharma touches your heart in the guided meditation? So there's a way in which we can use the thinking mind to uplift the heart. And it says further in this sutta that when we are thinking in this way, the mind is headed straight and it doesn't get distracted. It's not tangled up with greed, hatred, and delusion. And in fact, it will go not only toward joy, but also eventually toward concentration, which is interesting also, that certain forms of reflection can eventually lead to concentration. So then we can also look into the cognitive mind's ability to ask questions and explore the Dharma in various ways. So I'm talking now about inquiry as a way of clarifying the teachings and also going deeper into our experience. So the suttas report cases of meditators sitting in meditation, and it will literally say in the sutta, while the venerable so-and-so was sitting in meditation, a certain train of thought arose in his mind, his or her mind. And sometimes it will say at that point they went to ask the Buddha a question, or maybe they continued meditating and later they went to ask the Buddha a question about it. So there are times in which thoughts can arise kind of out of our sitting practice that are relevant for the Dharma questions related to the Dharma, or understanding the meaning of the teachings. And we don't need to call those unskillful and say, oh, thinking, oh, bad, I got distracted from the breath again. You don't necessarily go off on a long discursive thought trail about that, but you can remember, okay, my mind came up with the thought about the Dharma. Maybe I'll look into that later. Maybe I'll ask the teacher about that later. That's okay. There are thoughts about the Dharma that can be taken seriously, essentially. We want to take it seriously when our mind starts inquiring into the meaning of the Dharma. So then a more modern inquiry practice is like what we did in the sitting, where we can drop in a question. And it's not expected that we're going to come up with a clear, definitive answer that we could write down and carry around. Yes, I know the answer to that question. It's really more intended as a way to lead the mind deeper into itself. I've noticed when I do those repeating kinds of questions that sometimes the first few times I ask it, I get an answer that I kind of already knew, kind of a cognitive answer. But then after maybe, if I say, okay, thank you, and I rest for a moment and ask again, I start getting answers that are no longer at the surface level. Maybe I didn't know some of that. Maybe I surprised myself. Oh, I didn't realize that is also touching me about the Dharma, and something else and something else. And eventually maybe there's even a kind of a visceral response that doesn't have a word associated with it anymore. And then we know that inquiry is leading us deeper into the mind, deeper into the heart, and it's helping to integrate the cognitive mind with the heart, with the body. And that kind of integration is useful along the path. So it is clear, I think, from this that well-directed thought about the Dharma relating to practice has a place on the path. But it is true that this is not sufficient. The Buddha does say many times that the teachings cannot be fully understood by the cognitive mind. I'm going to read two different translations of a passage that's repeated throughout the suttas about this. One translation is like this: "This Dhamma is profound, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, to be experienced by the wise." And another translation says, "This principle is deep, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful, sublime, beyond the scope of reason, subtle, comprehensible to the astute." So we start to get the sense that although there is good thinking along the path, we're going to have to develop other Dharma qualities also. So the next level of skillful thought, if you will, is to begin directing the attention to stabilize the attention into samadhi, into some gathering of the mind. So letting go even of what could be called thought and arriving at more just a continuous attention. So some of the initial factors that support concentration are qualities that are called applied thought and sustained thought. So where we direct the mind. It's interesting that it's called thought, but this means directing the mind toward the meditation object. So if it's the breath, placing the mind on the breath, placing attention on the breath, or the body, for example, that act is actually a cognitive act. We are intentionally directing the attention, but it's a more subtle kind of mental act, right, than thinking, way more subtle than discursive thought, which is way up at the sort of top level. So we start to see that there's a refinement of how we're using the cognitive mind. And it begins to invoke other Dharma qualities, such as samadhi, concentration. We can also use thought to cultivate the heart qualities, like the Brahma Viharas. That's a word for loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. These are not exactly thoughts, but they are things that can be evoked through repeating phrases, which are thoughts, through directing the mind to the feeling in the heart. You know, these are other ways that we use our cognitive mind to cultivate very skillful qualities on the path that are taking us much deeper than the level of the thinking mind. Amazingly, thought can even be used to evoke the 7 factors of awakening. There's an amazing sutta that says that when one, this is about speaking about an advanced meditator, dwelling thus withdrawn, the meditator recollects the Dharma and thinks it over. It literally says recollects the Dharma and thinks it over. On that occasion, the awakening factor of mindfulness is aroused. How about that? So for someone who's meditated for a while, who has some understanding of how the thinking mind works, it's possible to think about the Dharma in a way that evokes mindfulness. Wow. It's a very surprising sutta and very interesting one. And it goes on to say that the other factors of awakening can be evoked this way also. So it's quite stunning. So I like to say that as we refine the cognitive mind from discursive thought, which we let go of and replace with more skillful thought, we then start to cultivate more and more wisdom-related Dharma qualities. And we come to have what I like to call the mind of Dharma, where the mind is just operating in a frame where it thinks about the Dharma when it breaks a cup, where it calls forth the Brahma Viharas as needed, where it understands what activity would be ethical in a certain situation. Our mind starts to become useful to us, really functional, really beneficial for continuing to walk the path. And we can cultivate this kind of mind simply through beginning with skillful thoughts. beginning by reducing the intensity of the unskillful thoughts and starting with the skillful ones right up at the surface level. From that, all of the rest can unfold all the way to the qualities of wisdom, insights, and awakening. But I hope this talk has at least given you the idea that the thinking mind is not all bad. You don't need to get rid of it any more than one needs to get rid of a child in order to become an adult. So it's a natural process. And it begins simply with replacing the unskillful side of the discursive mind, reducing the intensity, and replacing those with more skillful thoughts that will then lead the mind deeper. So may your practice bear great fruit, and may you come to love your cognitive mind as a tool on the path. Thank you.